China is arguably one of the most well-known examples of communism in the world, but its modern economy follows the playbook of capitalism, and this has helped it to become one of the richest and most powerful nations on the planet. In the last few decades, China has revolutionized itself through economic reform, and they've been quietly doing this through a capitalist model at breakneck speed. In this video, we're going to look at how they've done this by not only revolutionizing their own country, but also revolutionizing the way in which party-state capitalism can be used to completely turn the fortunes of a country around. In an effort to awake a sleeping economic giant, it promoted the formation of rural enterprises and private businesses, liberalized foreign trade and investment, relaxed state control over some prices, and invested in industrial production and the education of its workforce. By nearly all accounts, the strategy has worked spectacularly. And by all accounts, all of these factors are what we'd associate with free market capitalism. China's economy has grown 36-fold over the past 3 decades, mainly because of the reforms that have created a vibrant private sector, which now accounts for almost 2/3 of China's GDP. Since China began to open up and reform its economy in 1978, GDP growth has averaged over 9% a year, and almost 800 million people have lifted themselves out of poverty. In several of the highest performing years, the economy grew by more than 13%. Per capita income has nearly quadrupled in the last 15 years, and a few analysts have even predicted that the Chinese economy will be larger than that of the United States in about 20 years' time. This is the story of how China managed to do this using methods that you wouldn't expect from a communist stronghold. After taking power in 1949, then-party leader Mao Zedong wanted to boost China's economy through agricultural collectivization and nationalized industrialization. But when he died in 1976, his legacy was brutal. It was clear these reforms had failed. His social and economic campaign ended with the deaths of tens of millions of Chinese citizens, easily making it the biggest episode of mass murder ever recorded. However, this marked a turning point and extensive reforms introduced by Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping. He began China's transformation from a poor nation into one that would hold a huge amount of chips at the economic table. This was after a false start known as the leap outward, a state-led, investment-driven program with a focus on heavy industry. A good example of what economists call big push industrialization. But the program, pushed by Mao's successor, Hua Guofeng, lasted barely over 2 years. Instead, it was the influence of Chen Yong pulling the strings behind Deng that would prove to be the difference in starting a new economic way of thinking. Chen was in the shadows during the previous regime as he was opposed to what Mao was doing. He believed that the Chinese economy had long suffered structural imbalance. Too much investment in heavy industry relative to light industry and agriculture, and state sectors and planning being invested in at the exclusion of private sectors and markets. In his view, Hua's economic program, brought in immediately after Mao's death, made the Chinese economy worse. So Chen forcefully ended the leap outward, despite opposition from the State Council, and brought in his economic policy with the help of Deng. Structural adjustment was imposed across the economy. More investment was channeled from capital goods to consumer goods production. More money was allocated to agriculture. The government increased the purchasing prices for agricultural products by more than 20% in 1979, and significantly increased grain import. They also took steps to decentralize foreign trade and give more financial autonomy to provincial governments. This was seen as the economic foundation of socialism. The strategy was to devolve some rights to state enterprises and allow them to keep some profits. Beginning in 1979 and throughout the 80s, the Chinese government was massively incentivizing state enterprises. Deng and Chen brought collective farming to an end and allowed farmers to sell surplus crops for profit. Foreign trade and investment were promoted heavily, and investors were given tax concessions in return for revenue and technical knowledge in special economic zones in southern China. Never before in history had so many people escaped poverty in such a short time. The country is up there as the world's biggest exporter, while on the domestic front, significant improvements have been made in health, education, and other key services. Quality of life has never been better. But how does capitalism come into play? The Chinese Communist Party, understandably, still describes the realization of communism as the highest ideal, and maintains that China is not a capitalistic state. But like a lot of talk from the nation's leaders, this doesn't necessarily translate to reality. Because in practice, its leaders have long embraced capitalist methods and encouraged entrepreneurship. In fact, this has been integral to the country's success. Township and village enterprises were industrial operations formed in rural areas. During the first 2 decades of reform, they were the most revolutionary sector in the Chinese economy. Because they operated outside state control, they did not have guaranteed access to raw materials controlled by the government, but had to purchase them from the black market at a higher price. They were also outside of state-controlled distribution systems to sell their products, so they had to hire their own sales teams to travel all over China to find markets for their products. If you put this all together, it's essentially describing a business operating in a capitalistic free market. And it did not take long for them to outperform state enterprises, which had all the privileges and state protections, and because of the security, they had stopped being enterprising. These two sectors were now operating like a classic private and public sector found in Western society. That accounts for the rural areas, but the first private businesses in Chinese cities were started by people who didn't have a job in the state sector. Most were young city people who had recently returned from the countryside. During Mao's era, 20 million middle school graduates from 15 to 18 years old found in cities were sent to the countryside partly because the state could not create enough jobs. After Mao's death in 1976, they came back, but there were no jobs to be found with the state. Young, jobless, and restless, they took to the streets and even blocked the railway. The government had little choice but to offer self-employment to this disenfranchised generation. Private shops started to emerge in Chinese cities. It didn't take long for these businesses to stop the state-run monopoly in these cities. In 1980, with decollectivization already in progress, would-be industrialists across the country started to set up small-scale businesses. The creation of small economic zones we mentioned earlier significantly increased the erosion of the social systems of public ownership and a state-managed economy. The idea was to allow these areas to experiment with the market economy, importing advanced technology and managerial know-how, selling goods to the global markets, creating jobs and stimulating economic growth. Essentially a playbook for capitalism. But the experiments were confined to a few enclaves and strictly controlled so that they would not undermine socialism elsewhere, and if the experiments failed, the damage to the socialist ideal would be minimal. The country's leader had spotted a gap in the market of ideas. The Chinese ruler realized that you can have capitalism without democracy, meaning that capitalism was ideologically neutral and could serve the needs of the rulers at the time. Governance and economic principles could be completely separate, and one could exploit the other. Policies brought in under Deng kick-started a dead economy and encouraged investment from foreign firms. As capital continues to flood into China's bond and equity markets, it achieved the significant milestone of overtaking the US to become the top destination for foreign direct investment. Communism is alive and well in China, but with capitalistic characteristics. While China is politically totalitarian, its economy is now market-consistent, if not market-driven. China's unique economic model, communist capitalism, is not an oxymoron anymore. It works as long as entrepreneurs and enterprises obey the political order, which, of course, they do. The question then, now that capitalism is the engine of China's economy, what is communism today? For more videos on the most important topics from the world of economics, please subscribe to Tree's Economy. Thanks for watching.